Hi, I'm here with Tarek Zeidan. He is the head of Helem, which is the largest LGBTQ advocacy group in Lebanon. And Tarek, thank you for being here today. I wanted to take a chance to catch up with you. I know we spoke a few months ago. So first of all, for our readers, give us an overview of Helem and the work that you do in Lebanon.
Well, thank you, Michael. It's really good to see you again, even though it's virtual this time. So Helem is an LGBT rights organization that was founded in Beirut, Lebanon, back in 2001. And it's the oldest LGBT rights organization in the Arab world. And so we've been around for almost 20 years. And we specialize in providing protective services for the LGBTQ community that's living here in Lebanon, as well as creating community spaces and mobilizing the community for long-term change. And we do a lot of legislative and sort of policy advocacy across multiple different issues affecting the community, from workplace equality to decriminalization to empowerment through health. So we have a lot of concurrent projects, and right now we're also really doing a lot of development work and a lot of humanitarian relief because of the COVID-19 crisis and the economic and political crisis that Lebanon is going through at this moment in time.
Talk about how the pandemic has impacted the LGBTQ community in Lebanon. I know that things are getting quite bad, but give us an update about just how bad things are in Lebanon, and then how is that affecting the LGBTQ community?
Well, you're not exaggerating when you say things are really bad, because the COVID pandemic and the subsequent lockdown came at the tail end of a very acute economic and political crisis in Lebanon that started with the October 17 revolution. So already things were bad, and then things got monumentally worse because of the COVID pandemic. We've noticed like 6 new sort of challenges that were, not a very big priority in Lebanon before when it came to the community, but that sort of skyrocketed into being really, really difficult and very sort of vital issues for us to deal with. We are now dealing with acute food insecurity. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, we had approximately like 100 to 120 people in Lebanon that required humanitarian food assistance. This has jumped to more than 1,500 in a few months. And we're not just talking about, caloric hunger, which can be remedied by food boxes or food delivery services of food items that last long and are mostly sort of canned goods, etc. We're also talking about nutritional hunger, because the price of meat and vegetables has skyrocketed as well. So there's acute malnutrition when it comes to actually having access to nutrients. And you can't solve that with just food boxes. So this is something that we're dealing with now. We're also dealing with, soaring levels of unemployment, which there's now approximately 1 million unemployed people in Lebanon. This is a population with roughly 4 to 5 million inhabitants. So the amount is astronomical. And obviously the most vulnerable community, the LGBT community, is really hit hard by this, particularly, and even including those that work in the informal labor sector. The inability of you to, afford things and not having any access to income has led to evictions, which is leading to homelessness, which is incredibly dangerous in a city like Beirut, and also in other sort of urban centers in the country. It increases people's vulnerability to anything from violence to exploitation, etc. And it has also reduced access to healthcare, which I'm not just talking about, access to emergency rooms or hospitals, which is already incredibly low. I'm talking about access to medication, especially chronic illnesses, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, stuff like that. Unfortunately, in our part of the world, most people think, when you think of the LGBT community, you think immediately sexual health, or you think STIs, but in fact, the health concerns of the community are pretty much the same as the rest of the population. Two issues that are very COVID specific have also arisen. One is the sharp rise of cases of domestic violence, because so many people who can't afford to live on their own found themselves being forced to go back to their parents' homes or their ancestral villages, away from urban centers, which has obviously increased the levels of domestic violence, very similar to that we've seen with women around the world. The only difference is that LGBT populations tend to underreport the violence that they experience, and a really sharp rise in deteriorating levels of mental health. Helem's hotlines documented sort of a 30% increase in calls of people experiencing suicidal thoughts or what's called suicidal ideation, as well as very acute depression. And unfortunately, with the economic situation being what it is, there's resources that are now unavailable for us to even meet the demands of these challenges. Lebanon is currently imposing capital controls. There's already very stringent anti-money laundering policies within the banks. It makes it very difficult to withdraw money. There's caps on even withdrawing the local currency, which is devaluating, is going into hyperinflation as we speak. And on top of all of that, there isn't any foreign currency for you to buy stuff like medicine or stuff like Lebanon imports most of its goods. We don't really produce anything here. So this has really been a very, very difficult situation. On the other hand, we've also found that many existing organizations, humanitarian aid relief agencies, international agencies, you name it, that specialize in humanitarian aid, do not know how to serve LGBT communities. They don't know the first thing about it. And so, for example, let me give you a concrete example. We've had cases of gay men going to food dispensaries and asking for food boxes, and them being turned away because they're not, quote, a family, meaning they're prioritizing family units, which is obviously very traditional and heteronormative understanding.
Is the government doing this?
Well, some government subsidized programs, but it's also charities, it's also faith-based organizations, and it's also big international organizations whose local staff and even international staff don't know what to do when somebody shows up whose physical characteristics and gender expression do not match what's written on their ID card. So we've also found ourselves incredibly under stress to educate and work very closely and very quickly with relief agencies in order to fill this gap.
Mm-hmm. Talk about, you mentioned food insecurity, you mentioned cases of discrimination when folks are trying to access, COVID-related relief efforts. How has Helem tried to intervene or tried to help the LGBTQ folks in Lebanon who are clearly going through a very difficult time right now? How have you guys been trying to help these folks during this?
So we've been trying our best in order to fill in gaps where we see them, and which is sort of the short and medium term response. But we're also trying to put in long-term responses, because we really need to think about LGBT sort of liberation and rights from a development perspective, not just from a human rights perspective from now on, given the economic situation. So, for example, when it comes to food security, we did our fair share of food drives and of clothing drives and all of that. But what we're working on right now is setting up a community kitchen that's able to give hot meals, stews or salads or whatever, everything that has high nutritional content at least twice a week, which is the recommended bare minimum by the World Food Program for individuals in order to maintain their or to lower their nutritional hunger. Because there's a lot of different organizations that are giving out food boxes and sort of food services. So we want to make sure that we're filling in the gap. Same goes for health. So we negotiated something called the HEAL Clinic, which is part of the local American University of Beirut Medical Center, which accepts LGBT patients for free for diagnosis. Obviously, that doesn't include medication, doesn't include testing, but it does at least provide free diagnosis for individuals. We're working very closely with humanitarian aid agencies, UN agencies, and other sort of organizations that are both formal and informally being created as we speak in order to make sure that LGBT people are integrated. Really, the way we look at it is that this is a crisis, and it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity for you to really leapfrog through progress and take advantage of the fact that everybody's sitting and rethinking their modus operandi when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic, and realizing that it's a chance for you to sit at the table and then, never leave. And to make sure that what has been happening for years and years and years is now no longer acceptable, and that considerations of LGBT populations must be integrated in all of the development and relief efforts from now on. And the UN agencies in Lebanon have been very responsive to this. Bigger, more established organizations that are local, as well as sort of informal and sort of grassroots types organizations, have been also incredibly understanding and inclusive. This is not the norm, but this is an amazing start and a very promising sort of indication as to how LGBT people are more and more integrated into the fabric of Lebanese society.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, please. No, go ahead.
I was going to ask, one of the issues we've covered in Lebanon quite extensively, as you know, is the plight of LGBTQ refugees from Syria. I wanted to ask you, Tarek, how is this particular population being affected by COVID? And I can only imagine it's been quite a horrible experience for these folks who are still fleeing the conflict in Syria and are trying to come to Lebanon. So talk about that specific group if you could.
So Helem works very closely with UNHCR on processing and on sort of being the point of contact for LGBT refugees living in Lebanon. So we have a lot of experience with this topic. And as you said, in addition to the experience and dignity of displacement in a place like Lebanon that is highly xenophobic when it comes to Syrian refugees in particular, it has not been a positive experience. LGBT refugees do have access to specific resources that are reserved for them by UNHCR. This includes emergency cash assistance. This includes sort of pre-approved cash and food assistance. So there is at least a little bit of a lifeline for a small to medium-sized group of refugees. Unfortunately, with the current situation, Lebanese LGBTQ populations are now in comparable levels of poverty and suffer the same sort of kind of institutionalized discrimination because of the economic and political situation. What's worse is that there are so few resources to go around that sometimes both populations are quite resentful of one another because of perceived sense of privilege, when in fact the lack of resources, the lack of funding, the lack of ability to mobilize effectively under these conditions is really affecting both populations almost equally. Now, many Syrian refugees obviously face the possibility of resettlement in other countries because they are considered way too vulnerable to remain in Lebanon as queer or LGBT identifying refugees. But that's by no means guaranteed. And that option is not available for LGBT members of Lebanese members of the LGBT community here in Lebanon because they're not eligible for resettlement, even though they're experiencing comparable levels of poverty and of discrimination. So it's a really difficult situation. We're trying to stretch what resources we can get as far as they can go. We're trying to come up with community-based solutions for this. And we're trying to think in the long term of what does it look like in order to start building power and building capacity within the community in order for it to be able to secure its own livelihood and thereby also its own path towards liberation.
Can you just give us a little bit of a sense of context? Like, we in the U.S., we often talk about phase 1 of reopening, phase 2 of reopening. Where do things? Yeah, it's very confusing. DC's in phase 2, but in Lebanon, where are things in terms of, say, businesses starting to reopen? Can you give us just a sense of where the country is in terms of like travel bans, things of that sort?
So Lebanon is a very unique case because the government has to sort of balance COVID-19 sort of inspired restrictions, but at the same time, deteriorating and sort of vanishing economy. So many of the businesses that are closing down or that closed down for the lockdown never reopened because, the COVID-19 pandemic just added to the economic woes of most private sector enterprises. I mean, the industries that keep Lebanon or have kept Lebanon afloat economically were mostly the banking and services sector, and obviously the food and beverage industry. Those were the hardest hit, because of the the economic and political situation, and because of COVID. In terms of the phase 1 and phase 2, the Lebanese government did a pretty good job to limit the effects of COVID the first time around. Obviously, Beirut's not a gateway city. There's only one airport, so they were able to really control the amount of traffic coming in. But as soon as they opened up again, which is a similar experience that everybody else had around the world, COVID numbers began to rise up. And actually on Monday is when they reimposed certain restrictions. The problem is that you cannot go back to the first level restrictions because that will effectively cripple the economy. So there is going to be the airport has reopened and it is likely to continue to remain open, just with more stringent procedures in place. But really, honestly, it's anybody's game as to how effective these can be when the government is also very desperately trying to salvage what's left of the economy and to allow businesses to reopen at whatever percentage capacity, etc.
What are some of the new restrictions that were reimposed this week that you mentioned?
So on Monday there was another sort of reiteration that only essential businesses are allowed to open, only with 30% capacity. They reinstated the mask law, which means anybody caught without a face covering is liable for up to 50,000 Lebanese liras fine, which due to the old currency exchange rate was around $30, but now is probably, I don't know, $5 because of the hyperinflation.
That's how things have deteriorated.
That's how things have in just a few months.
Wow.
So that's why I'm saying, so we're in a situation that's very similar right now to Argentina, and some economists expect us to have a situation very similar to Zimbabwe if things continue as they are. If people are familiar with sort of the economic...
Yeah, with like 10,000% inflation or something.
Exactly, something crazy like that.
That's insane.
So, but we'll see. I don't know where we'll end up. I don't know what kind of financial misengineering the government was going to go through in order to try to remain afloat. But there's a huge amount of discontent with the government and with the entire political elite. And the October 17 revolution was sort of like our pride, because it was the visibility of the LGBT and the queer community in Lebanon was insane during the revolution. And it was sort of our own coming out as a community to our own populations. So we're very much in the thick of things as it is.
And this revolution on October 17th, just, again, clarify, is that when the pre-existing government was ousted? Is that right?
Yep.
And this was because of the financial mismanagement and just corruption and just overall discontent?
It's general corruption. It's lack of management and lack of cohesiveness within the ruling bodies in the government. But what was cool about it is that it wasn't a revolution for civil and political rights of certain groups. It was for economic rights for everybody. So the visibility of the LGBT community wasn't because we were down on the streets demanding decriminalization. We were down demanding healthcare, education, everything that had to do with the negative repercussions of the financial engineering of our or mismanagement of the political elite in Lebanon. So And this is all what we're seeing now is a continuation of that as well, in addition to our response to the COVID-19 crisis.
And then my final question for you, Tarek, and thank you so much for your time. What is the future for Helem, given everything that's going on in Lebanon with the COVID crisis, with the government crisis, the economic crisis? If you were to predict, where will Helem be, say, in 6 months or a year? Can you give us a little bit of a prediction on that? Nothing is really certain in Lebanon, but if you could, what's the future hold for you guys?
For sure. One thing I didn't mention about COVID is that, interestingly, many religious authorities around the region blamed LGBT populations for COVID-19. Mm-hmm. That it's a plague that has come down on us because of same-sex relationships or whatever. And this is not the first time we as a community have been blamed for a deadly virus. And so it was something that we expected. But there's really, it's very difficult to predict where we will be as a country 6 months from now. I don't know if we're going to remain as a country. I don't know if we're going to fragment into federal states. I don't know if there's going to be some form of an IMF loan that's going to temporarily balance things for a while, even though that's not a solution. And in fact, it's actually it contributes to long-term damage. But what I can tell you is that Helem is doing two things. One, strategically, it's adapting to this new reality and adapting to what constitutes liberation in a country like this and in a situation like this. So a lot of our work now a lot of our time is being spent diversifying our own understanding of liberation away from just legislative and policy reform and sort of community empowerment community engagement and mobilization, to community empowerment and to particularly engaging with the development framework, particularly talking about jobs, talking about services, talking about long-term sort of power building in the sense of capacity building, not just in terms of mobilization. And second, we're an organization that has existed for 20 years without registration, without, any single speck of support from the government or from anybody in power. It's very difficult to get rid of us because Helem isn't really an organization that survives because of its, financial resources or because of its ability or its power or its ability to influence people in power. Helem survives because its community is what makes it up. And the way we influence change is through mobilization on the ground from a grassroots perspective. So even if nobody's getting paid and there's nobody that has any salaries and there's no employees or any sort of formal programming, Hellem's a community space. It's the only non-commercial community space in the entire country for LGBT people, arguably the region. And this is where most of our the solutions of most of our problems have been solved. So I don't expect Helem to go anywhere as an organization. As long as there's a queer community and as long as it's being discriminated against, we're here. We're not going anywhere. And all of our solutions do not necessarily need to have a price tag or a tab next to them. We do our work because that's who we are and that's how we've always been. But if I was a betting person, I would say that it's going to be a very difficult 5 to 10 years moving forward. I think we're going to have to redouble our efforts in order to make sure that we don't lose any of the significant gains that we've gotten over the past 20 years, and that we maintain our levels of visibility and our levels of engagement with the wider population, and we don't let the ball drop. And, it's going to be a big challenge, but we're up for it.
Very good. Well, we'll have to leave it there. Tarek, thank you so much for your time. And as always, we'll continue to follow everything going on in Lebanon. And good luck to you all.
You too. My pleasure.
Thank you. Okay.